All right, listen up because what I'm about to tell you is absolutely wild. The Supreme Court just dropped a decision that has everyone talking. And I'm not talking about a typical 5-4 split where the justices are divided along party lines. No, no, no. This was a unanimous 9-0 ruling. Every single justice agreed. When was the last time you saw that happen on something this massive? Exactly. This is rare, this is significant, and this is going to change things in ways you might not even realize yet. So buckle up because we're diving deep into what just happened, why it matters to you, and what this means for the future of our country. Let's get into it. Okay, so first things first, what actually happened here? Let me paint the picture for you. For the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest court in the land, just issued a ruling that legal experts are calling a game changer. And here's the kicker. All 9 justices, from the most conservative to the most liberal, stood together and said, yeah, we agree on this one. And that's Justice Clarence Thomas on the same page as Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. That's Chief Justice John Roberts agreeing with Justice Sonia Sotomayor. You get the idea. This doesn't happen often, folks. Now, let me give you some context. In a typical year, the Supreme Court hears around 70 to 80 cases. Out of those cases, only about 30 to 40% result in unanimous decisions. But those unanimous rulings, they're usually on relatively minor technical issues, procedural stuff, the kind of cases that don't make headlines. But this is different. This ruling addresses something that affects millions of Americans, and it's sending shockwaves through the legal community, the political world, and everyday life. So what was the case about? Without getting too deep into the legal jargon, here's the deal. The case centered around a fundamental question about federal authority versus state rights. Specifically, it dealt with whether federal agencies have the power to override state laws in certain critical areas. Think about issues like environmental regulations, public health mandates, labor laws, or even digital privacy. The kind of stuff that touches your daily life, whether you realize it or not. The court's decision was clear and definitive. They said in no uncertain terms that the federal government does not have unchecked power to override state decisions in areas where the Constitution does not explicitly grant that authority. This is massive. Why? Because it fundamentally redefines the balance of power between Washington, D.C. and the individual states. Let me break this down even further. For decades, federal agencies like the EPA, the FDA, the Department of Labor, and others have operated under what's called the Chevron deference. This is a legal principle that basically says when a law is ambiguous, courts should defer to the federal agency's interpretation of that law. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, critics have long argued that this gives federal agencies way too much power, allowing them to create rules and regulations that feel like laws, but were never actually voted on by Congress. And here's where it gets interesting. In recent years, we've seen more and more pushback against this idea. States have been challenging federal overreach left and right. And now the Supreme Court has essentially said, you know what? The states have a point. This ruling doesn't eliminate federal agencies, but it does put significant limits on their ability to act unilaterally. The legal opinion itself was over 60 pages long. It was thorough, detailed, and deliberate. The justices didn't just issue a quick decision and move on. They took their time, laid out the constitutional arguments, examined historical precedents, and made it crystal clear that this wasn't a political decision. This was about the law, the Constitution, and the proper role of government. All right, so now you know what happened. But here's the big question. Why should you care? Why does this matter to you, someone who might not even be thinking about law school or a career in politics? Let me tell you why this is a big deal. This ruling is going to affect your life in ways you might not immediately see. Let's talk specifics. First, let's talk about jobs and the economy. Federal labor regulations touch everything from minimum wage laws to workplace safety standards to how companies can classify workers. With this ruling, states now have more power to set their own standards. That means if you live in a state that wants to raise the minimum wage higher than the federal level, they can do that without as much interference. On the flip side, if you live in a state that wants fewer regulations on businesses, they can do that too. This creates a patchwork system where your rights and protections as a worker might depend heavily on where you live. Second, the environment. Climate change, pollution, clean water, these are issues that affect all of us. Federal agencies like the EPA have been the primary enforcers of environmental standards. But now, states have more say. Some states might push for even stricter environmental protections. Others might roll back regulations to attract businesses. What does this mean for you? Well, if you care about clean air and water, you're going to need to pay attention to what your state is doing, not just what's happening in Washington. Third, technology and privacy. This is huge for teenagers and young adults. Think about social media, data privacy, online security. Federal agencies have been trying to regulate big tech companies, but they've faced legal challenges. With this ruling, states can step in and create their own rules. California, for example, has already passed some of the strictest data privacy laws in the country. Other states might follow, or they might not. The point is, the rules governing your digital life could vary wildly depending on where you live. Fourth, public health. Remember the COVID-19 pandemic? Remember all the debates about mask mandates, vaccine requirements, and business shutdowns? A lot of those debates centered on whether the federal government or state governments had the authority to make those decisions. This ruling tilts the balance toward the states. That means in future public health emergencies, your state government is going to have more control over how things are handled. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. This ruling doesn't just affect current issues. It sets a precedent for how future conflicts between federal and state power will be resolved. We're talking about a legal foundation that could shape policy decisions for the next 50 years or more. Legal scholars are already calling this one of the most significant Supreme Court decisions of the 21st century, and that's not hyperbole. This is up there with cases like Citizens United, Obergefell versus Hodges, and Dobbs v. Jackson. These are the cases that change the national conversation. But here's the thing that really gets me. This wasn't a partisan decision. Both conservative and liberal justices agreed. That tells you something. It tells you that this isn't about politics. It's about the fundamental structure of our government. It's about checks and balances. It's about making sure that power doesn't get too concentrated in any one place. Okay, let's get concrete. I know all this legal talk can feel abstract, so let me give you some real-life examples of how this ruling could play out. Example 1, education and student loans. Right now, the federal government has significant control over student loan programs. But with this ruling, states could push back against federal policies they disagree with. Let's say a state wants to create its own student loan forgiveness program that's more generous than what the federal government offers, or maybe they want to set different standards for how student debt is collected. This ruling gives them more legal ground to stand on. Example 2, gun laws. This is a hot button issue, and it's about to get even more complex. The federal government has certain gun regulations in place, but states have been pushing their own laws, some stricter, some more lenient. This ruling strengthens the argument that states have the right to set their own gun policies without federal interference, as long as they're not violating the Second Amendment. Expect to see more legal battles on this front. Example 3, housing and rent control. In cities across America, rent prices are skyrocketing. Some states and cities want to implement rent control measures to protect tenants, but federal housing agencies have sometimes pushed back, arguing that rent control distorts the market. With this ruling, states have more ammunition to argue that housing policy should be decided locally, not in Washington. Example 4, criminal justice reform. This is a big one. States have been experimenting with different approaches to criminal justice, from marijuana legalization to bail reform to sentencing guidelines. Federal agencies sometimes try to impose nationwide standards, but this ruling makes it harder for the federal government to override state-level reforms. If a state wants to decriminalize certain offenses or change how they handle juvenile justice, they now have more legal backing to do so. Example 5, energy policy. Some states are pushing hard for renewable energy, setting ambitious goals to phase out fossil fuels. Other states are doubling down on oil, gas, and coal. Federal energy policy has tried to balance these competing interests, but it's always been a tug of war. This ruling shifts more power to the states, meaning energy policy could look radically different depending on where you live. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. All of these examples share a common thread. They're about who gets to make decisions that affect your life. Is it bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., who might be thousands of miles away from your community? Or is it your state government, which is theoretically closer to you and more responsive to your needs? That's the core question at the heart of this ruling. And there's no easy answer. Some people believe strong federal authority is necessary to ensure equal protection and rights for all Americans, regardless of where they live. Others believe that local control is more democratic and better reflects the diverse values and needs of different communities. So here's the big question that everyone is asking. What happens now? Where do we go from here? The truth is, we're entering uncharted territory. This ruling is so significant that its full impact won't be clear for years, maybe even decades. But here are some things we can expect to see in the near future. First, expect a wave of legal challenges. States that have been frustrated with federal overreach are going to start pushing back harder. We're going to see lawsuits, lots of them, testing the boundaries of this new ruling. Every major federal regulation is going to be scrutinized. Lawyers are going to be very busy. Second, expect political battles. This ruling is going to become a major talking point in elections at both the state and federal level. Candidates are going to campaign on what this means for their state. You're going to hear phrases like states' rights and federal overreach thrown around constantly, and voters, including young voters, are going to have to decide which vision of governance they support. Third, expect changes in how federal agencies operate. Agencies like the EPA, FDA, and Department of Education are going to have to rethink their strategies. They can't just issue sweeping regulations and expect them to stick. They're going to need clearer authorization from Congress, which means more legislative battles. Fourth, expect growing disparities between states. This is the part that worries some people and excites others. As states gain more autonomy, we're going to see them diverge more dramatically in their policies. A teenager growing up in California might have a very different experience when it comes to education, healthcare, environmental protection, and workers' rights compared to a teenager growing up in Texas or Florida. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? That depends on who you ask. Now, here's something I want you to think about. Throughout American history, we've had this ongoing tension between federal power and state power. It goes all the way back to the founding of the country. The Federalists wanted a strong central government. The Anti-Federalists wanted more power left to the states. We fought a civil war, in part, over this question. We had the civil rights movement, which required federal intervention to ensure equal treatment under the law. And now we're having another chapter in this long debate. This Supreme Court ruling is a significant step in one direction toward more state autonomy. But history tells us that the pendulum can swing back. Future courts could decide differently. Future Congresses could pass laws that shift the balance again. This isn't the end of the conversation. It's a new beginning. But here's what makes this moment so critical. We're living in an era of rapid change. Technology is evolving faster than our laws can keep up. Climate change is forcing us to rethink how we use resources. Economic inequality is growing. Political polarization is intense. In this environment, questions about who has the power to address these challenges become even more important. And that brings me to a point I want to emphasize. This ruling isn't just about abstract legal principles. It's about real people, real communities, and real consequences. Every decision about federal versus state power affects someone's job, someone's health, someone's safety, someone's future. Let me take you deeper into the constitutional principles at play here, because understanding this will help you make sense of not just this ruling, but so many other legal and political debates. The United States Constitution is based on a principle called federalism. This means power is divided between the national government and the state governments. The founders did this intentionally. They wanted to prevent any single entity from becoming too powerful. They had just fought a war against a tyrannical king, after all. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This is a crucial sentence. It means that unless the Constitution specifically gives the federal government a power, that power belongs to the states or to the people. But here's where it gets complicated. Over the past century, especially since the New Deal era of the 1930s, the federal government has expanded its reach significantly. Why? Because we face national crises, the Great Depression, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement that seemed to require national solutions. Congress passed laws giving federal agencies broad authority to regulate everything from labor conditions to environmental standards to financial markets. For a long time, courts generally deferred to these federal agencies, trusting that they had the expertise to make complex policy decisions. That's where the Chevron deference I mentioned earlier comes in. But in recent years, there's been a growing sense that this deference went too far, that unelected bureaucrats were making decisions that should be made by elected representatives or left to the states. This Supreme Court ruling represents a correction, a rebalancing. The justices are saying, look, we need to get back to the constitutional design. Federal power has limits. States have rights. And when those lines get blurred, we need to draw them more clearly. Now, why did all 9 justices agree on this? That's the million-dollar question. Here's my take. Across the ideological spectrum, there's been concern about executive overreach. Liberal justices have seen Republican administrations use federal agencies in ways they disagreed with. Conservative justices have seen Democratic administrations do the same. Both sides have come to recognize that unchecked agency power is a problem, regardless of who's in the White House. This is actually a healthy development for our democracy. When justices can put aside partisan considerations and focus on constitutional principles, that's when the court functions at its best. It reminds us that law isn't just politics by another name. Law is about principles, precedents, and the careful application of constitutional text. Let me give you some global perspective because the United States isn't the only country grappling with these issues. In many countries, power is much more centralized. Take France, for example. The French government is highly centralized, with Paris making most of the major policy decisions for the entire country. Regional governments exist, but they have far less autonomy than American states. On the other hand, you have countries like Germany and Switzerland, which have federal systems similar to the United States. In Germany, the states, called Länder, have significant authority over education, policing, and cultural affairs. In Switzerland, the cantons have even more autonomy, and many policy decisions are made at the local level through direct democracy. Why does this matter? Because it shows there's no one right way to organize a government. Different countries make different choices based on their history, culture, and values. The United States has always prided itself on being a laboratory of democracy, where states can try different approaches and we can learn from what works and what doesn't. But here's the challenge in our interconnected world. Issues don't respect borders. Climate change doesn't stop at state lines. A pandemic doesn't check whether you're in New York or Texas before it spreads. Economic crises ripple across the entire nation. So while state autonomy is valuable, there are times when we need coordinated national action. This ruling doesn't prevent national action, but it does make it harder for federal agencies to act unilaterally. If we want strong national policies on major issues, we're going to need Congress to step up and pass clear legislation. We're going to need elected representatives to do the hard work of lawmaking rather than delegating it to agencies. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. You understand what happened, why it matters, and what the potential consequences are. But now let me tell you the most important part, what you can do about it. Because here's the thing, this ruling makes your voice more important, not less. If power is shifting more to the states, that means state and local elections matter more than ever. Your state legislature, your governor, your local officials, these are the people who are going to be making decisions that directly affect your life. First, get informed. Don't just scroll past political news on your feed. Actually read it. Understand what's happening in your state. What laws are being proposed? What policies are being debated? You don't have to become a political junkie, but basic awareness is crucial. Second, vote. I know, you hear this all the time, but it's true. And not just in presidential elections. State and local elections often have much lower turnout, which means your vote has even more impact. Research the candidates, understand their positions, make informed choices. Third, get involved. You don't have to run for office yourself, though you could, but there are plenty of ways to make your voice heard. Attend town halls, contact your representatives, join advocacy groups, use social media to raise awareness about issues you care about. Democracy isn't a spectator sport. Fourth, have conversations. Talk to your friends, your family, people who might disagree with you. We live in such polarized times that people often retreat into echo chambers. Break out of that. Engage with different perspectives. You might not change your mind, but you'll definitely sharpen your understanding. Fifth, think critically. Don't just accept what you hear from any single source, including me. Question things, look for evidence, consider multiple viewpoints. The most important skill you can develop in this era of information overload is the ability to think critically and independently. Let me take you back in time for a moment because history has a way of rhyming, even if it doesn't repeat exactly. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt pushed through an ambitious agenda called the New Deal. He believed the federal government needed to take aggressive action to Jew the economy and help suffering Americans. He created dozens of new federal agencies and programs. But here's the thing, the Supreme Court at the time wasn't on board. In a series of decisions, the court struck down several New Deal programs, arguing that they exceeded federal authority and violated the Constitution's limits on government power. Roosevelt was furious. He even proposed a plan to pack the court by adding more justices who would support his agenda. That plan failed, but over time, the court's composition changed and it became more amenable to federal power. For the next several decades, the court generally gave Congress and federal agencies wide latitude to regulate and intervene in the economy. Fast forward to today, and we're seeing a shift back in the other direction. This unanimous ruling is part of a broader trend of the court placing more limits on federal authority and restoring more power to the states. What's the lesson here? That these debates about federal versus state power are cyclical. They reflect the ongoing tension in American democracy between the need for effective national governance and the desire for local control and individual liberty. Neither extreme is sustainable. A federal government with unlimited power can become tyrannical and unresponsive, but a system where every state goes its own way can become chaotic and ineffective at addressing national challenges. The goal is to find the right balance, and that balance shifts over time as society changes, as new challenges emerge, and as we learn from experience. This Supreme Court ruling is part of that ongoing calibration. All right, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about what this Supreme Court ruling actually says, why it matters to you, what real life impacts it could have, and what you can do about it. Here's my final thought. This ruling is a reminder that our system of government is dynamic. It's not static. It evolves. Whether you agree with this ruling or not, the important thing is that you're thinking about it. You're engaging with these issues. So here's what I want you to do. Hit that subscribe button if you want to stay informed. Smash the like button if you found this breakdown helpful. And most importantly, drop a comment below. Tell me what you think about this ruling. Remember, you have more power than you think. Your vote matters. Your voice matters. Your engagement matters. This is a pivotal moment in American legal and political history. Thanks for watching. Peace out.